This week, Jewish women rarely get a fair shake in pop culture, often showing up as flat stereotypes like the Jewish American princess trope. But over the past decade, especially on TV, that's been changing. So I talk with Dr. Samantha Pickette, author of Peak TV's Unapologetic Jewish Woman, all about that. I'm Lev Gringauz, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. As of the release of this podcast, it's day 408 of Russia's war in Ukraine. If you want to revisit what this war has meant for Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Jews, you can check out some of last year's episodes from this podcast. Number 72, Ukrainians Are Jews Now, number 73, The Belarus Connection, and number 82, My Homeland is Ukraine. If you want to donate to help Ukraine, Ukrainians, and Ukrainian Jews, there's a link in the podcast notes with resources to do that. A bit of a disclaimer, this will be the second to last episode of this podcast for a while. If you've been tuning in over the past few months, you'll know that at Jewfolk there's a lot happening, like our expansion to Cincinnati. And frankly, between family and work responsibilities with all this going on, I'm kind of overwhelmed, so we're putting The Jews Are Tired on hiatus after the next episode so I can focus a little more on all that other stuff. But okay, let's get to Peak TV's Unapologetic Jewish Women. This is a book just recently published by Dr. Samantha Pickette, the assistant professor at the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Texas, Austin. By accident, I came across Pickette tweeting about her book a few months ago, and it piqued my interest. The Jewish community is having so many conversations about how we're portrayed, from whether and how much non-Jews should be cast to play Jews, to how stereotypical of a portrayal of obnoxious rich Jews we're willing to accept. By the way, on the casting issue, go back and listen to episode 69 of this podcast for a fascinating conversation about that with Michal Schick, an Orthodox screenwriter, podcaster, and former culture journalist. There's also a distinct conversation about Jewish women, given that so many of the portrayals we're used to of Jewish women are one-dimensional, sexist caricatures, often created by Jewish men, like author Philip Roth and filmmaker Woody Allen. And those caricatures have carried over and become in many ways central to comedy in this country, making Jewish women the butt of endless jokes, many of which are punching down for a laugh. And this stuff is so ingrained that there are plenty of people, including other Jews, whose perceptions of Jews are shaped by stereotypes of Jewish women. So given all of these things, how fascinating that someone wrote a book about the way that Jewish women are being portrayed on TV and how that portrayal over the past few years, specifically on comedic shows, has evolved from what it used to be. And a lot of that is also to do with more Jewish women producing and running these shows, so it's about representation on screen and also behind it. So Pickette was kind enough to come on the podcast and talk with me all about her book and these complex issues of representation. A lot of our conversation does revolve around the show The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, by the way, because it's such an interesting, multifaceted example of some of the best portrayals of Jewish women right now, and also some of the worst. Honestly, I've had a bone to pick with that show for a long time, so it was personally kind of nice to get that out of my system in talking to Pickette. But we cover a lot, from how and why Jewish women became stereotyped like this, to whether we are actually moving in a better direction when it comes to representation. And yes, I also snuck in some questions as a Midwesterner poking a sharp stick at the very East Coast portrayals of Jews and Jewish women. I highly recommend you buy a copy of Pickette's book. It is a little pricey because it's from an academic publisher, but it's super worth getting and reading. A link to buy it is in the podcast notes, along with a code to get 30% off both the ebook and hard copy when you buy directly from the publisher, so it's a little easier on the wallet that way. And if you enjoy this podcast, Pickette was also a guest on The Bagel Report, the pop culture podcast that I'm editing and producing in partnership between Jewfolk and Jay, the Jewish News of Northern California. So that episode will be linked in the podcast notes if you want to hear more from her. The Bagels had a very different conversation with Pickette than she and I did. So, okay, let's get to it. This conversation has been edited for length and clarity. Enjoy. So, Peak TV's Unapologetic Jewish Woman. Why write this book, and what made you want to write it?
The way that the project sort of started was I presented at the Association for Jewish Studies conference a few years back with a paper I had written about Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. And I had kind of just come to that paper as a fan of the show who was, watching it with my professor cap on and also, my Jewish woman cap on. And so I watched the show and I found that I had a lot to say about it. And so I wrote this conference paper, presented at the conference, and that paper ended up getting published. And from there, I found that I kept wanting to think about Jewish women on TV because beyond just Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, which, I talk about extensively in the book, there are so many examples from the past decade of series that are created by and written by, and in some cases starring Jewish women that have these really interesting Jewish female characters that, in my mind, defy stereotypes and are kind of bringing about a newer, more contemporary version of the Jewish woman within American pop culture. And so it just kind of sprung from me loving TV and being really sort of interested in what I was seeing and also really excited about what I was seeing because it seemed so different. The kinds of Jewish women that were appearing in these series just seemed so different from examples that, I was familiar with from earlier sort of television series.
And why focus in your book on the comedic portrayal of Jewish women specifically? Like, on the one hand, very fitting, sort of Jewishness and comedy is really intertwined in the US. But I guess to ask the obvious, what does comedy allow us to understand about Jewishness and womanhood that maybe other genres don't have the same clarity with?
I think that comedy, and maybe it's just by the nature that people don't often take comedy very seriously. I think that comedy actually is one of the most transgressive genre forms that exist, and that within sort of the realm of what comedy can do, there's a lot more room for boundary pushing and subverting expectations because you have the sort of elements of parody and satire and just the sort of levity that comes with it that allows for a little bit more of a transgression of the norm. And with Jewish women and comedy in particular, I think that there's such a rich and interesting history of Jewish female identity building happening in conjunction with comedy, and comedy being a space where Jewish women can really sort of claim their voices and articulate their identities in their own words, as opposed to being stereotyped and kind of having people pigeonhole them into these one-dimensional categories, the Jewish mother and the Jewish American princess, the ugly duckling. Like, comedy becomes a mechanism, I think, where Jewish women are sort of able to, literally and figuratively take the microphone and say, no, this is what's going on from my perspective. And, I have a voice and now you're going to listen to it. And so for me, I just think that comedy and these comedic series are just so interesting to look at because they're really kind of taking advantage of what comedy as a genre can do. And in doing so, sort of introducing a more kind of unapologetic, less stereotypically inclined version of the Jewish woman. And really, one of the things that I think is interesting as well is the fact that because Jewish women have this kind of intersectional identity where they're othered for both their gender and their Jewishness, there's also a lot that can be said about how, Jewish women's comedy, unlike Jewish men's comedy, is often much less about stereotyping Jewishness and problematizing Jewishness and kind of identifying Jewishness as their major source of otherness. And it's more about kind of identifying what it means to be in the world as a woman. And then there's this added layer of Jewishness to that. So it's sort of a different approach, I think, to communicating what Jewish identity is than what you find in male-driven Jewish comedy.
just feeling the specter of like the Woody Allen-y, Rothy depictions of the like things over everything. So your book is tracing portrayals of Jewish women from the past decade and comparing that directly with the classic TV stereotypes of Jewish women. And you mentioned this a little bit, but before getting into what you see in today's Jewish characters, let's talk a little bit about how you view the characters of yesteryear. Again, to ask the obvious, but with a little bit of a twist, what are the classic female Jewish stereotypes? And to set you up for more than just listing them, what have those stereotypes meant in the context of TV storytelling? Because it feels like a lot of what you cover in your book isn't just a function of here's a character with certain defining traits, but the story and the context around the characters as well. It's not like Jewishness isn't just what's in the character, it's the surroundings. So yeah, to hand that back to you.
In terms of stereotypes, I think the two most important and most obvious, and one that people are probably most familiar with, are the Jewish American princess and the Jewish mother. And both of those stereotypes are really interesting because they're born out of a very, very specific cultural moment in the kind of post-war era of suburbanization where Jews are kind of ascending into the middle class and transitioning from being considered a foreign immigrant entity to being, American, still like American with an asterisk, but like members of the club in some way, shape, or form, part of the middle class. You have the establishment of the kind of triple crown of American religions, Protestantism, Catholicism, Judaism. And so there's this kind of sense of ascent and also arrival on the part of American Jews in this time period, which of course leads to incredible anxiety, because what does it mean to really assimilate into Americanness? And how does somebody maintain Jewish distinctiveness while they're also kind of making their way into this new world? And so all of that ambivalence kind of translates to a little bit of a cultural panic. And one of the ways that this panic is mitigated is through comedic stereotypes in literature, in film, in popular culture, in stand-up comedy that target Jewish women as a sort of symbolic repository for all of this communal anxiety. And so, the architects of these stereotypes are men, and they basically infuse both the mother and the princess with all of the concerns that they're feeling about joining the American middle class and kind of finding acceptance within this sphere. The Jewish mother, with her smothering and her overbearingness and her sort of anchor to like traditional values, holds the, Jewish son and the Jewish husband back from being able to actually make it into the American mainstream the way that they want to. The princess is the other side of that coin. And so she's too assimilated, culturally empty, devoid of anything that's actually specific to Jewish culture, Jewish heritage, Jewish religion. No, she's the only Jewish stereotype that has American in the name too. And she is basically a symbol of American materialism and emptiness, through manipulation, her, money obsession, her shopping obsession, all of the sorts of things we know about her. And so the stereotypes are kind of born out of this sort of idea that Jewish men are figuring out what it means to be in this new kind of American sphere, to be accepted into this new sphere and be, players out in a like American middle class society that had been closed to them up until this point. And so the women kind of become the coping mechanisms that they use to either blame their lack of acceptance or blame their over assimilation and sort of lack of Jewishness. And then there's also all sorts of stereotypes in there as well about, Jewish women being inferior to non-Jewish women. And so that's where you get all of the like Philip Roth, Woody Allen stories where you have Jewish men rejecting Jewish women and then going off with a non-Jewish woman because it's so much better. And so in terms of like television and female characters that have defined the network era, and up until this contemporary moment, I think that one of the things that's kind of striking is there really aren't that many. The first Jewish female character in an American sitcom was Molly Goldberg on Gertrude Berg's series, The Goldbergs, which had been a wildly popular radio series and then transitioned to TV. And she was kind of this classic Yiddish mama, sort of proto-Jewish mother character where all of the Jewish mother's characteristics were spun in a very positive way. She was really loving and sort of this, balabusta who took care of everyone around her. Very, Yiddish old world sort of character. And once that show went off the air, there were no Jewish female protagonists on TV until Rhoda Morgenstern in the Mary Tyler Moore Show. And that was like 15 years after that. So huge gap. There are some Jewish men who appear on TV, but like Jewish women just aren't there. And Rhoda, she's interesting because on the one hand, you have this really kind of cool, relatable character who is presented as somebody that the audience is supposed to really see themselves in. And she acts as a kind of foil to Mary, who is more all-American and aspirational and perfect. Like everything that she does is kind of, what it's supposed to be. And Rhoda is the one who messes up more. But it's in a way where she's really relatable. And the fact that the audience is supposed to kind of connect to a Jewish character, an explicitly Jewish character in this way, I think is really powerful, and it normalizes Jewishness. But at the same time, the version of Jewishness that it's normalizing is one that's incredibly steeped in stereotypes, both related to, perceived Jewish looks, Jewish behaviors. The only way that we really know Rhoda's Jewish other than her saying it is, she's from New York, where everybody else is from the Midwest. She has a complicated relationship with food and her mother. And there's no actual cultural specificity there. She's not a Jewish character who has anything noticeably Jewish about her outside of the realm of these stereotypes that, are kind of brought out when they need to emphasize her ethnic difference. And then after Rhoda, which, she goes off the air in 1978. There's not another Jewish female protagonist on television until The Nanny, which starts in 1993. And, The Nanny, again, similarly to Rhoda, on the one hand, she is a character that is incredibly proud to be Jewish. That show has a lot more cultural specificity. It's also actually written and created and presented by a Jewish woman. And so there's self-representation happening there. On the other hand, the entire show revolves around the Jewish American princess stereotype, as do most of the shows that have Jewish characters in them in the 90s. I mean, like Rachel Green from Friends is a classic princess. Monica Geller from Friends is sort of a hybrid princess, ugly duckling. And so, what you're seeing, I think, up until the 90s and early 2000s are two main things. Not a lot of Jewish women, like very, very few and far between. And when they do appear, it's usually in a role that's very stereotypically conceived or very reticent to actually show any kind of Jewish engagement or concrete kind of depiction of what a Jewish identity can look like.
So you make the case in this book that modern Jewish portrayals and characters then sort of reject and subvert those classic stereotypes, albeit imperfectly, which I'll come back to in a little bit. But when you're talking about the unapologetic Jewish woman, where do you see that in sort of modern times? What are the features of a character or a story over the past 10 years that make you go, okay, this is something different and arguably better?
Well, I think that there are two things that need to happen in order to really kind of get to that sort of ideal point. The first is a character who doesn't rely on old stereotypes. And so when you look at a lot of characters from contemporary series, things like Broad City or Difficult People, Transparent in some cases, Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, there's a lot of character building that emphasizes the interiority and humanity of the Jewish woman. And as a result, rejects a lot of one-dimensional Jewish female stereotypes that sort of aim to define what the Jewish woman is by objectifying her and sort of defining her through a series of negative characteristics that are supposed to make up who she is, as opposed to actually letting her have a voice and a perspective. But the other major component that I think is equally significant is the actual presence of Jewish engagement, like Jewish culture, Jewish religious ritual. The series that I talk about in my book, for the most part, all of them feature Jewish characters that are actively engaging in variations of Jewish rituals that normally aren't seen on TV. And so, up until I would say like the early 2000s, there's not really a lot of actual Jewish religious depiction, like engagement on TV. I mean, the Goldbergs had an episode where they actually featured a significant part of the Kol Nidre service, which was, groundbreaking and kind of amazing. But other than like the Seinfeld episode where they have a bris, most Jewish TV episodes that revolve around Jewish holidays are either Hanukkah, and usually Hanukkah in relation to being inferior to Christmas, or a bar or bat mitzvah. Every so often you'll get maybe like The Nanny had a Passover episode, but there's not really a lot going on in these episodes that speak to why anybody's actually doing these things or that indicate that anybody cares. And in, the shows that I talk about in the book, you have characters sitting Shiva when their relatives pass away and, covering the mirrors and actually like following some of the traditions. You have characters celebrating Shabbat in ways that are meaningful for them. Difficult People has an entire episode that revolves around one of the characters trying to find a yahrzeit candle for a loved one. The episodes that feature holidays and traditions that are maybe a little bit more familiar to audiences, like, Passover, become infused with much more meaning and specificity. There's a Transparent episode where they're on a family cruise ship and they try to recreate a Seder plate using just what they can find from the ship's buffet. And the thing that I think is really sort of special about this level of engagement is it's done in a way that reflects, I think, the way that many American Jews engage with Judaism. There aren't a lot of observant people in these series. Like they're not, necessarily religious in any kind of sense of the word, but they're still Jews who deeply feel their Judaism and it's important to them. And they come to it when it's meaningful to them. And they also shape it in ways that they find significant. There's a sort of, Nathan Abrams calls it a post-denominational Judaism. And I think that that's what you see a lot on TV, where it's not so much about kind of like heavily constructed practice as it is like coming to something because it's meaningful to you. There's an episode of Grace and Frankie, for example, where Lily Tomlin and Sam Waterston's characters are finalizing their divorce. They're with their 2 adult sons, cleaning up their house, like packing the house up. And Sam Waterston's character asks if they can light the Shabbat candles one more time as a family. And it's not a Friday night. It's not Shabbat. Like there's no reason for them to actually be doing it, but they do the ritual together with the prayer because it's something that their family did together and it's meaningful to them. And so they engage with, that ritual in a moment of intense feeling and vulnerability. And so that idea, I think of Jewishness and Judaism as something that isn't just a set of cultural stereotypes, but rather is like a deeply felt identity that isn't always at the surface, but is always there, I think is something that's different about contemporary TV. And you can see it in a lot of different examples. And it's, I think, I don't want to say better because I feel like that's too simplistic, but I feel like it's a healthier, more robust way of depicting what Jewish identity actually is.
So now I want to get a little bit more specific. And to do that, let's talk about The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, both because what an incredible show. And despite actually admitting to you that I would not have time to read your book before this interview. I did buy it yesterday night to at least read the introduction so I didn't seem like a complete idiot when being, an interviewer. And then I read the entire chapter on Mrs. Maisel in one sitting because I just started and couldn't put it down. And it just got at all the really great and really frustrating things about that show that have plagued me for a while. So listeners, here's a reminder to buy the book, link in the podcast notes to do that. But one of the things you write about in terms of Midge, Mrs. Maisel's protagonist, is she's written as an unapologetic Jewish woman, but you sort of note how the show around her and the rest of the characters are apologetic, both about womanhood and about Jewishness. So there's this really complex, like 2-step forwards, 1-step back kind of thing, where the show both breaks stereotypes and also very much reinforces them. And this isn't the only show where that happens. So this is all a long setup to ask you, can you tell listeners more about that complexity, that tension between individual character and overall show that now seems to define TV's Jewish woman? Because it's almost like we haven't really left the stereotypes behind, even as Jewish showrunners and writers are in charge of these kinds of shows and doing much more complex portrayals. Like it's a very, very weird, lots of stuff happening in that. So
I think with Mrs. Maisel, it's a really sort of interesting case study because of its creator. And so Amy Sherman Palladino, who, created and writes almost all of the episodes of Maisel and directs most of them as well, has sort of complete control over the universe that the show takes place in. She's also the creator of Gilmore Girls, the CW series that was wildly popular like 15-ish years ago. And the thing about her sort of sensibility, which I think is really interesting, is she tends to have really complicated, interesting, like stereotype defying protagonists. And then she surrounds them with a bunch of caricatures. And it makes for a very fun, but mostly frustrating TV watching experience. Because on the one hand, you have a character like Midge who can't be pigeonholed into any category, who, you see her career flourishing. You get this sense that she's this, incredibly sort of special person. And she's unconfined by stereotypes. She refuses to let herself be defined by the tragedy that happens at the beginning of the series where her husband leaves her with, 2 young children. And she makes a life for herself as, a single mother, as a stand-up comedian, as a daughter, navigating all of this within the scope of, relatively conservative social landscape of late 50s, early 60s, upper middle class America. And yet, while all of that is happening, she's surrounded by characters who reinforce all of the kind of ugly stereotypes of Jewishness that we are familiar with and that have, been on TV since its inception. And I think one of the reasons why she does it is because she's obsessed with the idea of having a female protagonist who is singular and exceptional. And she's too obsessed with the idea of Midge's exceptionalism. And so nobody is allowed to be as groundbreaking as Midge is or as good as Midge is at anything, because somehow I think that there's sort of a sense that if anybody competes with her, then she'll somehow not be as remarkable. And so, you see it, I think, especially with the characterization of her parents and of her ex-in-laws. And, both couples sort of represent very one-dimensional kind of patterns of Jewish stereotyping. Her parents are, upper middle class. They've ascended into this kind of like waspy American world. And so they're much less marked as Jewish, but they still really encapsulate the father, Abe, is this nebbishy kind of effeminate professor intellectual. The mother, Rose, is a cold, kind of judgmental, manipulative, materialistic Jewish mother, Jewish American princess hybrid. And then her, in-laws, the Maisels, are lower class. And so their Jewishness is much more pronounced and kind of connected to an immigrant culture, even though they're both American born. And so, Shirley is a kind of overbearing, I need to feed you type of Jewish mother. And Moish is this kind of pushy businessman who's always making these seemingly under the table deals. And, the characters, they're used in ways that are arguably funny in some capacity, but it's a kind of humor, I think, that depends just on the audience's sort of familiarity with what the archetypes are meant to represent. And I think it's interesting and it's sort of disappointing because if you were just watching the parts of the series that relate to Midge, her stand-up, sort of like her stand-up routines and her kind of experience in the clubs and like figuring out that sort of part of her world. It's a really groundbreaking series that not only defies stereotypes of Jewishness, but it defies stereotypes of, femininity. It kind of offers a reframing of this mid-century version of Jewish femininity and flips that whole kind of paradigm on its head by empowering the Jewish woman and giving her a voice and giving her perspective. There are lots of, moments where we see her engaging with Jewishness in ways that are meaningful, celebrating holidays and things like that, cultural sort of references. And, there's a lot of, I think, Jewishness infused into the show, but the side characters are so one-dimensional and kind of stereotypically inclined that it ultimately, I think, detracts from the series' impact as a series that is speaking to or talking back to stereotypes that pigeonhole Jewish women. So I don't know, it's one of those series where I love it, but I also hate it for a lot of reasons.
So I now want to sort of use that conversation to ask somewhat of maybe a weird question, but I'm curious to both play devil's advocate with it, and maybe it expresses some of my immigrant kid Soviet Jewish angst about American Jewish obsessiveness with East Coast stereotypes and stuff. But, despite the complexities, your book and you seem to sort of take a positive perspective on a lot of the changes that have happened, the deeper characterizations, the more expressive Jewishness, in the characters and storytelling for Jewish women on TV. I can't help but want to challenge that a little bit, given some of the issues that are still around, because in what you're describing, even if the characterization is deeper or certain stereotypes are being broken, the Jewish stereotypes on the whole still feel just as ingrained and just as frustrating and just as one-dimensional as they were before. And again, to sort of use The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel as an example and to just hold it on one particular aspect, you write about one of the jokes Midge Maisel tells in response to a heckler at a gig. The guy says, "Go back to the kitchen." And her response is, "I'm Jewish, I pay people to do that." Which I remember watching that and going, that's funny. And then the next instant, my brain went, wait a second, that's so middle to high class Jewish American princess. That's the stereotype right there. And even though Maisel as a character is complex and strong and boundary breaking, we're still fundamentally watching a show about a person who fits squarely in that that Jewish American princess stereotype. And even you point out in the book that there were lots of working class Jewish female comics in the 1950s. We see none of them in the show. We see none of their influence. So overall, it doesn't really feel like we're moving in a positive direction with Jewish and female Jewish portrayals. Everyone's still either nebbishy or well off or both. So, wanted to punt that back to you and get your thoughts a little bit more on, are we moving in a positive direction when it just feels like there's a lot of good stuff happening, but it's just covering up the same, frankly, shit we've had to deal with before when it comes to these portrayals?
I think that's a really good question. And it's something that I thought a lot about when I was putting together the case studies and sort of deciding on the general tone and cadence of the book itself, because I agree with you. They're especially I start the book by talking about Crazy Ex-Girlfriend and The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, because those series, I think, out of all of the other examples that I look at, in the book are the most tied to classic stereotypes. And, part of that has to do with sort of like TV industry standards. The CW is a television network. And so network TV is different from streaming content. And Amy Sherman Palladino sort of stylistically loves to deal in caricatures and stereotypes, and did so with Gilmore Girls and, Roseanne, which she also wrote for. And so that, I think, is a little bit more of a style thing necessarily than indicative of large patterns in television in general. But what I will say is that I think that we can still be sort of positive and see progress within the TV that's happened in the past decade or so, because even though we're still sort of struggling to break free from a cultural lexicon that is steeped in classical Jewish stereotypes, what I'm seeing in especially streaming series and series that are coming from younger, sort of late Gen X, early millennial creators, are series that are no longer really interested as much in those archetypes. Broad City is an example that I come to multiple times throughout the book, because I think that it really encapsulates this kind of peak TV sort of moment. It was on, Comedy Central. And so technically it's a cable series, not a streaming series, but it starts as a grassroots web series that Alana Glazer and Abby Jacobson just, decided that they would start filming. And then eventually it got picked up because it gained some traction and gained a loyal following. But the way they conceive what Jewishness is and what Jewish femaleness is so different than really any of the other series that we look at. There's no shame at all associated with anything having to do with Jewishness. And part of the thing about all of the sort of stereotypes that existed is they're all steeped in shame. They're all sort of deriving from the same sort of worry about what it means to be too visibly Jewish and what it means to be seen as Jewish. And, of course, conflating Jewishness with something negative and bad that you need to separate yourself from. And in Broad City, there's such a sort of unapologetic embrace of Jewish identity. It's something that's both parenthetical in the sense that it doesn't define every aspect of, their lives, Abby and Alana's, but it's also something that's deeply ingrained and deeply felt. And I think one of the most telling things about that show that speaks to forward progress is the fact that they are not the only well-rounded, well-defined Jewish characters on the series. And so we actually, in the series at different points, meet both of their mothers. And unlike a show like Mrs. Maisel or Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, where you have kind of the normal Jewish female protagonist who gets to be a fully formed human being, and then the parent generation who are insane and infused with every stereotype you could possibly imagine, what Broad City does is they actually make the mothers and daughters sort of twins of each other. And so there's this idea of an intergenerational female Jewish inheritance where becoming like your mother is actually a really good thing, because within the world of Broad City, Jewish mothers and daughters are able to be friends. There's this actual mutual understanding where even though they come from, different generations and have different worldviews, they're actually seeing things from the same perspective and able to see each other as people. And I think that that's particularly telling, that it's a series where you have very openly Jewish characters. You have, characters who are living on their own, coming home and doing things with their Jewish families. And none of the usual Jewish jokes are made. None of the patterns exist. The families are so infused with love. And the parents understand the children. The children love their parents and admire them as people. And at the same time, the backdrop of everything that's happening is Jewish. The Broad City episode, I think that encapsulates it the best is the one where Alana's mother, her grandmother, dies, and they sit Shiva for Grandma Esther. And the whole series, the whole episode in like typical Broad City fashion revolves around a whole host of inappropriate things that happen. And it's very irreverent the way that the Shiva unfolds. But at the core of the episode is the sort of love story between Alana and her mother, played by Susie Essman. There's none of the sort of expected stereotypical dynamic that you would imagine would appear in an episode like this. Her mother doesn't nag her. She's not overbearing. There isn't any tension. They love each other. And Alana eventually, actually spends the episode helping her mother confront the loss of her own mother and, helps to kind of mitigate her mourning process. Alana's father is presented instead of, the typical sort of emasculated Jewish husband. He's an incredibly sensitive and caring partner to his wife as she's struggling. Alana's brother is in the mix. And the two children are living completely sort of non-traditional lives in the, their jobs and their lifestyles and the way that they do things. And their parents are super proud of them. It's nothing that you would expect. And so I think that, that series compared to something like a Maisel or a Crazy Ex-Girlfriend that are a little bit more traditional or stereotypically defined, sort of conventional in their approach, I think is much more groundbreaking. And it kind of speaks to, I think, a different generational outlook. There are things that still need to be worked on. I don't by any means make the case that TV is perfect now and that we should just stop because we've reached the pinnacle. But I do think that within the past decade, even with some pratfalls, there have been significant gains made. And it's because of series like, Broad City, Difficult People is another one, Transparent, Grace and Frankie. These are series where I think you have a version of Jewishness that really has nothing or very little, at least, to do with previously existing stereotypes.
I also wanted to ask, just sort of out of curiosity, because it feels like what you write and what we've talked about covers the gamut in terms of, there's so much to the stereotypes that are sort of happening and also being unfolded in terms of Jewishness, class, job type, relationship with parents. There's all these different elements. I wanted to ask where regionality sort of fits into that to you, because it feels like, and this is maybe my Minnesota pride coming in of Midwest, but it still feels like a lot of portrayals are very East Coast centered. And that also just is sort of an itch of, I don't know quite how to articulate it, but it just seems also curious about there's so many Jews not there. And, even if there are many Jews, there's something to that feels also a little bit weird and maybe alienating to a lot of Jews who see a lot of recognition in these shows, but also that always feels a little weird.
Well, I think that that's one of the major weaknesses that contemporary television is still experiencing and needs to work on. I think that even with all of the gains that have been made, contemporary television portrayals of really Jews in general, not just series that have to do with Jewish women, are incredibly East Coast specific. Sort of the Ashkenormativity is very much in play, where it's all Jews are from Eastern European backgrounds and they all came through Ellis Island and settled in the Lower East Side and now live in New York in some way, shape, or form. And I think that idea, unfortunately, is alive and well in contemporary TV. And I think there are some sort of kind of seedlings of deviating from that a little bit in series that are relatively new or, within the past couple of years or so, mostly in terms of depicting Jews of color and more diversity in terms of who can be Jewish and what Jewishness actually looks like as opposed to what we expect it to look like. But I think we are very much still at a point where Jewishness is expected to look like and sound like and come from, certain places. And those sorts of social scripts still very much kind of dictate our cultural expectations of what Jewishness is and isn't. And I'm hoping that one of the next kind of hurdles that Jewish TV can overcome is that sort of getting away from those sorts of like essentialist ideas, because obviously Jewish identity, American Jewish identity, is way more geographically diverse, ethnically diverse, racially diverse than anybody really gives it credit for. And I think that one of the problems is that there just aren't enough stories out there, and we need to have fresher voices and people who are trying to kind of reframe Jewishness in these ways. And I think that there are some people who are slowly but surely starting to do that, but it's not necessarily reached mainstream TV yet.
So I also want to go on a little bit of a tangent because it would be maybe not misguided, but I feel like I'd be missing something if, speaking to you, someone who, knows and is seeped in and studies Jewish culture on the big screen, basically, or the small screen, I guess. In your introduction, when you cover the history of Jewish TV portrayals, you mentioned that a lot of Jewish characters were played by non-Jews. And this is obviously a very big topic of conversation today. So I wanted to ask this in case it went anywhere interesting. Should non-Jews playing Jews in the classic TV era where those characters were distinctly stereotyped change how we think about non-Jews playing Jews today, notwithstanding that today's Jewish characters are on the whole way more fleshed out? So just wanted to sort of pick your brain on that. Alternatively, sort of, does it change how you approach that conversation?
I think it's a really interesting question. And the idea of casting is something that I do go back and forth on, because on the one hand, I do think it's incredibly limiting to say that only Jews should play Jewish roles. And, acting means acting. But on the other hand, Jews are often left out of conversations about identity politics. And it does seem like there is something to the idea that Jews should be representing themselves. And it's also, with classic TV, it's incredibly frustrating because when you think about some of the casting choices that were made, like Valerie Harper, who played Rhoda, was not Jewish. And she was encouraged to, gain weight so that she was heavier than Mary Tyler Moore and would read more Jewish. But she wasn't Jewish. But the actor who played her non-Jewish husband that she ended up marrying on her spin-off series, Rhoda, Dave Grohl, he was Jewish in real life. And they cast him as Italian because I think that they didn't think that she would, a series that had a Jewish woman marrying a Jewish man and having a Jewish married life would appeal to people. And so those sorts of decisions are crazy to me. And I don't think that the casting conversations that we're having now, relate as much to the casting decisions that were made back in the day that I think stemmed very much from a sort of sense that people from the Midwest wouldn't want to watch anything that had too many Jews on it. But in terms of just talking casting in general, I think the bigger conversation to have is not, does it matter who's cast in what part, but rather how the part is actually conceiving Jewishness. Because I, for example, and I talk about this in the book, I have no problem with the fact that Lily Tomlin, who's not Jewish, is playing a Jewish mother character in Grace and Frankie, because her portrayal of Frankie is so nuanced and so lovely in its kind of warmth and reframing of what Jewish motherhood can be. That doesn't bother me. Tova Feldsha's portrayal of Naomi Bunch on Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, she is Jewish and she's playing a Jewish character. And it's the most stereotypical Jewish mother you could possibly imagine. There's nothing redeeming about this woman. And so I think that the question that I come to is less, does it matter when a non-Jew is playing a Jew, and more, why are we still sort of writing these very stereotypical roles. Like, why aren't we more concerned with how we're communicating what Jewishness is rather than figuring out who should be playing which parts? It's more, I think, about what the parts are conveying. And like, Tony Shalhoub, who plays Abe Weissman on Maisel, has been very vocal about how, actors act and you should be able to play whoever. And I agree with that to an extent. I also, his portrayal of Abe as, sort of an effeminate nebbish, I don't love. It feels very sort of stereotypically inclined, very kind of performative, like he's putting on some sort of Jewish mask. Would I feel more comfortable with it if he was Jewish? I don't think that would matter to me, because the character itself is conceived in a way that the performance and the way that the performance is directed, and the way that the performance is used is sort of, if not problematic, at least not interesting, not doing anything new.
So it's fascinating to hear your answer. And I got to say, during the Mary Tyler Moore part, just for listeners, my eyebrows were skyrocketing. I mean, that was like, I shouldn't be surprised, but there's sometimes you hear these things and you still go like, wow. And yeah, that is a really good point. And I think that also ties into sort of the thought that I also keep having in the back of my head of, and for listeners, this is something we talked about on the Christmas and Hanukkah episode of, like, so many of the things we find issue with are nowadays it's Jewish creators reinforcing these things regardless of who's playing the character, like in Mrs. Maisel. So it's the dynamics of this are really fascinating, the way it sort of plays into the community, but also out of the community and all those different ways. So to end off the podcast and to sort of bring it all back, where do you see female Jewish comedic portrayals of TV heading? And or what do you want to see? You've got plenty of positive analysis in the book, but also, of course, lots of criticism, as we've covered. So where do you hope things go, and what should the rest of us expect?
I just hope that there's even more diversity. I think that one of the things that's beautiful from a content perspective and horrible from a wallet perspective is that there are so many streaming platforms and so many places where you can find TV now. We're no longer confined to a handful of like network channels and, even cable channels. Like, we have really unlimited choice, and you get to watch whatever you want, whenever you want. And what it does from an industry perspective is it opens the doors for people who might otherwise not be able to create their own series and actually have their shows be produced. And so I just hope that television kind of continues from an industrial standpoint with that kind of bent, where there's lots of room for creativity and sort of niche programming that's not meant to be for everybody, but actually is specifically for an audience of people who get it. And I think with that, hopefully there'll be more diversity in terms of representation as well. We see that a little bit with, series like Orange is the New Black, which had a, African-American character converting to Judaism and becoming Jewish in their third season. There are Jews of color on, certain TV shows. Big Mouth, the Netflix animated comedy, has Missy Foreman Greenwald, who's Black and Jewish. Grace and Frankie has Bud, who's Black and Jewish. And so there's a little bit more kind of racial diversity, not as much as there should be, but sort of hints in that direction. You have on something like, and just like that, diversity related to gender and sexuality. And so you have, the last couple of episodes of the first season of that series had Charlotte's child sort of come out as non-binary and questioning and didn't want to have a bat mitzvah. And so they ended up having they called it on the show a they mitzvah, which isn't really a thing, but, a b'nai mitzvah, a b mitzvah. And those are actually happening. Those are things that kids are doing now when they don't want to necessarily buy into the gendered sort of component of the coming of age ceremony, but they want to have a bar bat mitzvah. And so the fact that a mainstream HBO series, a reboot of a wildly popular series, had a B mitzvah, just in their show, and actually took the time to explain what it was and why it was happening. And, the rabbi was played by a trans actor. I think that speaks to a level of sort of diversity and moving forward and expanding perspectives that hopefully is a harbinger of more things like that to come. And even something like Russian Doll, which, is more mystery comedy, dramedy than just straight comedy. But, with that, you have so many complex aspects of Jewish culture that have absolutely nothing to do with American Jewish cultural stereotypes or even like Jewish American cultural landmarks or references. Everything that happens in Russian Doll is rooted in Yiddishkeit. And like there are even like Kabbalistic undertones to a lot of what happens, especially related to, the way that the series uses numerology and like the kind of concept of the Gilgul. Like there's so much within that show where when you're watching it, you're kind of like, it feels like engaging with a version of Jewish culture that TV hasn't actually acknowledged before. And it's still an Ashkenazi Jewish culture. It's an Eastern European Jewish culture, but it's a version of that that's so far removed from the kind of like Jewish American, let's go sit in a deli and that's what Jewishness is kind of version of Jewish culture, that it feels very groundbreaking. And I think also speaks to a diversification of how Jewish storytelling can happen and still reach mainstream audiences who get different things from it. Like not everybody has to get every single reference in order to enjoy it. So I'm hoping that those sorts of strides just kind of speak to a greater diversity and more voices, more content, more characters. I think it's one of those rare cases where more is actually more.
This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringauz. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week, the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com. A link to the transcript of this episode is available in the podcast notes, along with links to any news, stories, or reports referenced for this episode.